when Clint Eastwood stepped into one of LA's most upscale restaurants wearing nothing more than a simple polo shirt and casual slacks, not a single person recognized the legendary actor and director. That's when an overly confident waitress made the biggest mistake of her career, attempting to throw out and humiliate a man she assumed was just another unremarkable, elderly customer. What she failed to realize was that Clint Eastwood didn't just have a reservation, he owned the entire restaurant. And what followed next became a Hollywood legend. In true Clint Eastwood fashion, he transformed this uncomfortable moment into an unforgettable lesson in respect, one that the restaurant would never forget. It was a lively Friday evening at the Grand Oak. The recently remodeled dining room buzzed with LA's elite. Young tech entrepreneurs in designer suits, social media influencers capturing their gold-plated desserts, and wealthy old-money families maintaining their long-standing traditions. Amidst the glittering crowd, a man sat quietly at a corner table, dressed in a simple gray polo shirt and relaxed slacks, slowly sipping a glass of whiskey. Most of the seasoned staff knew exactly who he was. How could they not? But when Clint Eastwood discreetly purchased the Grand Oak 6 months earlier, he had given strict instructions. He was to be treated like any other guest during his routine visits. He firmly believed that the true quality of a restaurant was measured not by how it catered to celebrities, but by how it treated everyday customers. Rachel, the restaurant's newest waitress, had no idea about any of this. Fresh out of a prestigious hospitality school and eager to build her reputation as a food influencer, she had spent most of her shift doting on social media personalities while casting disapproving glances at the casually dressed man in her section. Across the room, Thomas, the longtime manager, observed with growing concern. He had seen that same look in Rachel's eyes before. The same dismissive glare she had given a retired surgeon just last week for daring to wear loafers instead of formal dress shoes, but tonight was different. Tonight her snap judgment would lead to consequences she could never have imagined. As Rachel's sharp heels clicked toward Clint's table, Thomas held his breath. The experienced staff members tensed, sensing the storm about to unfold. The quiet man in the polo shirt took another sip of his whiskey, the slightest smirk forming at the edge of his lips. Rachel arrived at the table, an iPhone partially visible in her apron pocket, her professional smile carefully practiced but hollow. "Sir," she said, voice sweet but laced with condescension, "I couldn't help but notice you've been nursing that house whiskey for quite some time now." Clint lifted his gaze, meeting hers with the same steady calm that had once faced down some of Hollywood's most powerful executives. "It's a good whiskey," he replied simply. Rachel continued, her tone dripping with feigned politeness. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at the bar. We're expecting several reserved parties, and this table," she gestured toward the pristine white tablecloth, "is usually set aside for our fine dining guests." A young busboy named Miguel, who had immigrated from Mexico 2 years ago and worked tirelessly to support his family, overheard the conversation while clearing a nearby table. He knew exactly who the man in the polo shirt was. He had grown up watching Clint Eastwood films with his father. His grip tightened around the bus tub, struggling to remain silent. "I'm comfortable here," Clint said in his usual composed manner, taking another sip. Rachel's polite facade cracked slightly. She glanced at her watch, then at a group of young tech executives waiting near the host's stand. "Sir," she pressed on, her tone more insistent, "our executive chef prepares an exclusive menu. The prices," she paused, looking him up and down, "reflect the caliber of our establishment." At the next table, an older couple who had dined at the Grand Oak for over 2 decades exchanged uneasy glances. The husband started to speak up, but his wife placed a hand on his arm. She recognized the look in Clint's eyes, one that had preceded some of cinema's most unforgettable moments. "I'm aware of the prices," Clint replied, his voice carrying that familiar gravelly tone that had commanded audiences for decades, "and of the chef's work." Rachel's forced smile disappeared. With a sharp, irritated motion, she pulled out her notepad. "Well then, sir," she said curtly, "should I go over the menu for you? Slowly, perhaps?" The last words had a clear bite to them, a not-so-subtle jab at his age. Miguel, still close by, couldn't take it any longer. He stepped forward, speaking softly but firmly. "Miss Rachel," he said, his voice steady, "maybe I should get Thomas." Rachel shot him a sharp glare. "Stay out of this," she snapped. "Go bus tables. That's what you're here for." She turned back to Clint, who had watched the brief exchange with particular interest. "Now, sir," she said, her voice rising slightly, enough for surrounding tables to hear, "one last time." The tension in the dining room thickened. Other guests pretended not to watch, but the stark contrast between Rachel's growing frustration and Clint's unshakable composure was hard to ignore. "This isn't some roadside diner," Rachel continued, her voice growing sharper. "This is the Grand Oak. Maybe in your day things were different, but we have standards now." Clint slowly set down his whiskey glass with deliberate precision, a movement so subtle yet commanding, it held the weight of a defining cinematic moment. "In your day," he repeated, raising an eyebrow slightly. "Yes, your day," Rachel scoffed, "when people thought they could just walk into any place, dressed however they liked, order the cheapest drink on the menu and take up space meant for real customers." She was fully committed now, her pent-up disdain for unfashionable patrons spilling out, unchecked. "Times have changed," she declared. "This is a luxury establishment, meant for people who appreciate modern elegance." Miguel had stopped even pretending to clear tables. He stood frozen, watching the disaster unfold. Behind him, Thomas, the manager, finally noticed the situation spiraling out of control and hurried toward them. "Modern elegance," Clint mused aloud as if testing the phrase. Then, shifting his gaze back to Rachel, he asked, "And what exactly does that mean to you?" The sound of her name caught her off guard. She wasn't wearing a name tag, but she recovered quickly, assuming he had overheard another server using her name. "It means," she declared with certainty, "that some places aren't for just anyone. Our clientele expects a certain ambiance." She gestured toward a group of young entrepreneurs snapping selfies with their gold-plated desserts. "They get it. They respect what the Grand Oak represents. They're not here pretending to be something they're not." The irony of her statement hung in the air. A few veteran servers exchanged knowing glances. Thomas was now just a few steps away, his face pale. "Pretending," Clint mused, that familiar half-smile returning. Interesting choice of words. "Listen," Rachel snapped, her patience completely drained. "I've tried to be polite, but you clearly don't belong here. This isn't some set from one of those old cowboy movies. This is a prestigious establishment, and I won't let you ruin the experience for our real guests." The moment the words left her lips, the entire restaurant seemed to freeze. Thomas halted mid-step. Miguel, standing nearby, dropped his bus tub, the crash echoing through the now silent dining room. At the next table, the elderly couple audibly gasped, but Clint's expression remained unchanged. Without a word, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and made a single call. "Jerry, could you bring me the ownership papers? Yes, right now. And the renovation plans we discussed last week." He set the phone down and turned back to Rachel, who was beginning to sense that something had gone very, very wrong. "You see, Rachel," he continued in that same quiet, unshakable voice, "I've been coming here every Friday for the past 6 months, sitting at the same table, ordering the same whiskey. Want to know why?" Rachel's face was rapidly losing color, the implications slowly dawning on her. "Because 6 months ago I bought this restaurant, not for the prestige, not for the so-called modern luxury, but because for 50 years the Grand Oak stood for something real, a place where genuine hospitality meant treating everyone with respect, regardless of what they wore or how many followers they had." The silence in the restaurant was absolute. You could have heard a napkin drop. Moments later, Jerry, the restaurant's longtime accountant, appeared with a leather portfolio. He approached Clint with a respectful nod, handed him the documents, and stepped back, barely hiding his smirk. Rachel stood frozen, her order pad hanging limply in her hand. The reality of her situation crashed down on her in waves, each realization worse than the last. She hadn't just insulted a customer. She had insulted Clint Eastwood. She hadn't just insulted Clint Eastwood. She had insulted her own boss. And not just any boss, a living legend who had built his career portraying characters who stood up against exactly the kind of arrogance she had just displayed. "Miss," Clint said, his voice carrying the same gravelly authority that had commanded respect for over 6 decades in Hollywood. "Let me tell you a story about this place." He gestured around the dining room. 50 years ago, I came here for the first time. Wasn't famous yet. Wasn't anybody. Wore a shirt pretty much like this one. He glanced down at his simple polo. The owner back then, Old Man Thompson, treated me like I was the most important guest he'd ever had. Not because of who I was, but because that's how he treated everybody. He paused, taking another sip of his whiskey. When his son decided to sell the place 6 months ago, I bought it for one reason: to preserve that spirit. He set his glass down with quiet finality. Real class isn't about designer labels or social media followers. It's about dignity, respect, and treating every person like they matter. Nearby, Miguel straightened up a little taller. The elderly couple at the next table nodded approvingly. Even some of the younger influencers had put down their phones, caught up in the moment. "So," Clint continued, fixing Rachel with that same legendary, unwavering gaze, "the question isn't whether I belong here. The question is whether you understand what this place really stands for." Rachel's eyes filled with tears, the weight of her mistake pressing down on her. But what happened next surprised everyone, especially her. "I could fire you right now," Clint said, his voice softer now but still firm. "But that's not what this place is about." Instead, he turned to Miguel. "This young man tried to warn you," Clint continued. "He recognized me, not from social media but because he grew up watching my films with his father. He understood something you didn't. Respect isn't about appearances." Then, looking directly at Miguel, Clint's voice carried the quiet authority of a leader. "Son, how would you like to start training as a waiter? We could use more people who understand what real service means." Miguel's eyes widened in shock and gratitude. "Yes, sir," he said quickly. "Thank you, sir." Clint turned back to Rachel. "As for you," he said, "your choice is simple. You can walk out that door and find a job at a place more focused on modern luxury, or you can stay, learn from Miguel and our veteran staff, and understand what real hospitality is all about." The entire restaurant seemed to be holding its breath. Rachel wiped her eyes and looked around. The faces of the longtime staff, dignified, professional, and understanding, watched her in silence. Finally, she exhaled, shoulders dropping, and made her decision. I'd like to stay and learn, sir," she said, her voice unsteady. "If you'll let me." A slow nod from Clint. "Good choice." He finished his whiskey and set the glass down as Thomas stepped forward. "Thomas," Clint said, "put Miguel in charge of her retraining." As the tension in the restaurant finally dissolved, the elderly couple at the next table began to applaud. One by one, others joined in, not for the celebrity in their midst, but for the lesson they had just witnessed. A reminder that true class has nothing to do with clothing or status, but everything to do with how we treat each other. Today, the Grand Oak remains one of LA's finest restaurants, not because of its luxury, but because of its heart. And if you stop by on a Friday evening, you just might see a man in a simple polo shirt sitting at his usual corner table, quietly ensuring that the old values of respect and dignity live on. Hey everyone, this was Ludwig. If you enjoyed this story about real class and timeless values, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe. And let me know in the comments, have you ever been judged unfairly? How did you handle it? See you in the next video.